So Laurel, welcome. It's great for you to be with us here tonight, and thanks for making us to join us.
Oh, thanks so much, Tom. It's an honor to be here, and I really appreciate the invite to this conversation.
Great. So I uh, uh, as those who have been at other of these events know, I there's a couple of questions that I've asked everybody. One at the beginning and one just before the Q&A. And so the starter question for all of our guests has been if you could just describe a recent natural history encounter that kind of enriched your day. It can be anything, and we're just trying to get glimpses of different ways that natural history has uh, uh, how different people, different perspectives on the world, how natural history plays a role in their lives through getting these little references.
Sure. I love that as an opener. I woke up this morning to a Carolina wren singing out my window in the frigid kind of winter landscape. But I think if I were to go for something maybe a little more dramatic, what jumps out to me in the last few weeks, I'm getting a little echo. Is that just me?
I'm hearing that
Um,
too. It's
okay. Um, But I married into what I think is one of the most beautiful landscapes in North America in the San Luis Valley in southern Colorado. And I was there a couple weeks ago visiting family for the Thanksgiving holiday. And I took a little break from kind of the family madness and went a couple miles away to the Monte Vista Wildlife Refuge. And this is an area, just for folks who might not know this landscape, they call it the largest alpine valley in the world, and it's just very dramatic, big sky country. The valley floor is like 8,000 feet, and you're surrounded by 14,000-foot peaks in every direction. It's just a vast, kind of severe landscape, but it's one of the big migratory stopovers for sandhill cranes. And I'd happened to be there just towards the tail end of their southbound migration. And I don't know, I got out of the car and was standing just where you can see it felt like dozens of miles in any direction. And I don't know if it was a coyote or what set them off. But I had just noticed that, a mile away there was a group of cranes, but they all took a light simultaneously, and there was over 1,000 of them. I stopped trying to count because it just got kind of lost in the awe of the moment. But they all came over me, and if you've ever heard them, you can hear a single sandhill crane from more than a mile away, and this was 1,000 of them, all just chortling and warbling, and at the same time. And so it was a total just sort of sonic immersion. And then as they covered the sky, it created almost sort of a strobe effect of shadows, on the desert floor. And they just for multiple minutes on end, it was just there was nothing in the world but these magnificent cranes, and it was just kind of froze time. And it was one of those moments, just knowing like with all the transformations and destruction that we've wrought upon the landscape, here they are doing what they've been doing for thousands, maybe tens of thousands of years. And it was just one of those very reaffirming and inspiring moments that I don't think I probably will ever forget. I was going to say won't soon forget, but that was, one of those birds is magnificent, and 1,000 of them at close hand is just marvelous.
yeah. Yeah, there's definitely something incredibly transcendent about encountering that species, especially in the winter when they're congested like that. In fact, I've just noticed in the last few days several different friends in different parts of the West posting things describing basically what you just described from different places, and we've certainly had those experiences ourselves down in southern Arizona. So thank you. And a Carolina wren's pretty cool too.
Well, and they sing, full voice in the winter, which I just wasn't something as a relative newcomer to the East Coast that I had expected. So that's been a daily delight.
Yeah, great, great, great. Well, thank you. Um, So I want to kind of jump right in here because to one of the kind of overarching issues that I think is kind of at the core of what we're talking about here tonight, and in fact that I think is a key issue in working in the saving the world side of our equation here tonight. And that is that some people would regard environmental protection or ecological protection and human social justice as somehow at odds, or that there's a hierarchy between them. And that's a view that I know neither you nor I would agree with. But you're just a perfect person to talk to about this because your work has been right at the intersection of those two things, and sometimes focusing more in one direction, sometimes more in the other. So, so can you just share with us what have you gleaned in your more than 20 years of focusing your advocacy right at that crux of those two things? Or, you know, what do people have right about that? What do people have wrong about that? How would you like to see that shift? Or
Sure. I mean, I can start by saying I've definitely had my own journey. I started my passion to become an activist. I didn't ever set out to be a lifelong activist, of course. I don't know if anybody does. Um, but my passion stemmed directly from my love for the natural world. And I think, just as a teenager, and even before, the first times I witnessed the destruction of the natural world, or, fields being cleared with bulldozers or trees falling, it didn't strike me in an intellectual way or a philosophical way. It just was like a punch to the gut. It felt more like if someone comes up to your front door and kicks the door in and comes after your family with a knife, it's like you don't, it felt very personal and very visceral. And so, for me, I very much came at this kind of life of work from, that love of the natural world and sort of the response to it, to the destruction. But definitely along the way, have realized that, you know, fights for social justice, fights for human rights, and fights for the natural world are completely inextricable. In fact, I would say I think it's a very dangerous dichotomy to even, make a distinction, because I think a lot of the damage that we've caused to the world, and a lot of the mental and social illnesses that we have, come from that kind of very Western notion that there is a, a separation between humans and the natural world. And I think, there's a way in which, just like we see in wars around the world today, that in order to do horrible things to other people, you have to create the other. That you have to dehumanize, in order to do terrible things to someone else, because you wouldn't do that to your friend, someone you have affection for, or intimacy with. And I think that that's exactly, in many ways, the same with the natural world, that, it's that illusion that there is a boundary, between us, that allows us to perpetuate destruction and not realize that what we do to the natural world, we're doing to ourselves. And so, I think there's many different lenses on that. The ways that it plays out, not in just a kind of intellectual way, but, we see that it's a very disproportionate impact. The environmental pollution and the effects of things like fossil fuel extraction, are not, born equally. We look at places like Cancer Alley in the Gulf South, or, there's too many examples to refer to, but it's very much, Black communities, brown communities, indigenous communities that are, getting cancer and dying younger, and having their communities torn apart by kind of the violence of our extractive economy. And then on the other side of that, with the emerging impacts of climate change, we're also seeing the people who are first impacted, and the people who are most severely impacted are the people who have had the least to do with causing the problem in the first place. So, so that kind of environmental justice lens, is crucial, to taking sort of responsibility and realizing that the two are the same. Um, but then I also, kind of fundamentally believe from the other direction that, that the world needs, desperately right now is defenders, and people who will, fight for the natural world, but people won't fight for what they don't love. and they can't love what they don't know. And we've also got a situation where, a big part of our population has been cut off from direct experience with the natural world. And so they grew up with the natural world being something to be afraid of, or to be suspicious of, or to feel like that's not my, there's an access there for me. And so I think that's another reason, to break that barrier down, because we very much need people who know where they live and build affection and have a sense of place like that. So yeah, I think it just, we could have the whole discussion could go on just on that topic, but I mean, I think also um just on a pragmatic level, uh we won't be successful in our efforts. People who are basically just struggling to meet their, basic needs and to provide for their families, can't realistically be expected to uh, defend and have the energy and ability to defend the natural world as well. So, I think uh, uh, healthy communities, healthy ecosystems, it's all a permeable membrane, we're all breathing the same air. And more and more in our kind of globalized world of global economy and global climate crisis, there's no realistic distinctions that can be made.
Thank you. That's a great summary of all that. So, I've heard more than I wish from certain activists that, well, until we solve racism or fill in whatever blank, then environmental stuff has to take a back seat until we solve these human problems. And I'm hearing you say that's a very false dichotomy.
Well, and yeah, and also it's, I think, more and more, I think environmental movement is getting on board with the reality that um, the most effective way to uh, preserve forests or landscapes is to defend the rights of the people who know them best. And if that's indigenous communities or forest dependent communities, those are the people that will fight the hardest, and who know the land the best. And these top-down approaches of trying to draw a circle around an area and call it a protected land, or try to exclude people who might have been part of a landscape for centuries, it just doesn't work. Besides not being ethically a good idea, it's just not strategic. And over and over, we can see examples in both directions where that kind of fortress uh, uh, model of conservation it isn't working. And then we can see other places where indigenous land rights have been protected, where communities have been empowered to have a good livelihood and be supported. And then in turn, decades later, those are the landscapes that are having the best conservation successes. So it's really, they go hand in hand.
Yeah. So to sort of summarize, both from an ethical, like doing what's right, and also from doing what's effective, what works, that they both lead to the same place, which is get rid of that boundary between those two things. Yeah. Well, that ties in a couple of the things. One, somewhat as an aside here, but you and I were talking a little bit beforehand about an issue that's gotten a lot of press in the last month or two. That a lot of people watching here might be interested in, is this recent decision by the governing bodies of ornithologists, those who study birds, deciding to, in an effort, there's been a lot of concern about that many of the common names of North American birds in particular were named for people who we no longer necessarily think of were great people. And in some cases, and this extends to John James Audubon himself, may have exhibited sort of racist behaviors, etc. And so the decision has been made to change all of those names. And interestingly enough, at this point, it's just the common names, not the scientific names. But the and so there's a lot of uproar about that. Some people thinking it's a great decision. It's past due, and others thinking like, my God, what these names have taken on a meaning of their own. Townsend's warbler or whatever it might be. So I'm just curious, as one who's again working at that sort of joinery between environmental issues and human rights issues, and one who's especially interested in birds, what's your take on that? Because we didn't actually have time to finish our conversation.
Yeah, I think it's very fascinating. It has been quite surprising to me the speed with which, this has gone from kind of a discussion into something that's actually being implemented. And I think it's really heartening. I don't know if I mentioned before, but as you know, my kind of gateway drug into natural history was birds. And I was, became kind of very focused on birds when I was about 13 years old. And then from there, bees and, butterflies and trees and rocks and the rest of it. But so that means it's been, about almost 35 years of being really into birds. And so some of the folks who are like Ken Kaufman and some of the old guard who are, very prominent now, I had the chance to spend time with when I was even, teenager and it's been fascinating to watch, their perspectives evolve in real time. And I think there was a lot of, I think, knee-jerk kind of like this is a distraction and what's the point? And it just feels kind of and I've seen, I think, some real thoughtful reflections by some folks who have put their lives into promoting birds and being kind of the poster kind of, folks for birds really come around and listen to, especially to a younger generation who's saying, when you pull the strings, a lot of these, individuals whose names we're, saying every day, are really problematic. And I think a really smart choice has been made not to go one by one and decide, who was racist and who did what, and, but just to kind of take it a little back a step and say, why should these species, that have been, part of a spectrum of evolution for millennium, be named by, one, almost invariably European, who, came across them and, recorded them in some way. That person is almost certainly not the most important person in that bird's history. And so there's a real arbitrariness there too. So I think it's a really important conversation, and I think it's one of those things, there's no harm done. And I think there's only good done. And in fact, a little bit more of a conversation I've seen that I really, think is neat is um, the importance of trying to name the birds out of some special part of their habitat, especially their breeding habitat, because that could have real conservation implications. If we call the Swainson's warbler a rhododendron warbler, then, that could really help in efforts to protect Appalachia's rhododendron groves, because that becomes then it becomes an emissary, and so I think there's a lot of benefit that can come from it, and I don't see any downside. So and I think it's, yeah, definitely a reflection of our times, and I think a hopeful one for how a conversation can evolve relatively quickly once people start to do some deeper thinking.
And so you're basically saying parallel to what you said to the larger question of where we started, of that it's both, in your mind, it's both the right thing to do and also the strategically effective thing to do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see where it goes. But like you, I've been kind of amazed at how it's accelerated pretty quickly. A lot of it seemed to start with discussion of the name of the National Audubon Society and various subsidiary organizations, and that's of course been quite fraught. And the National Audubon Society ultimately decided to keep its name, and some of the subsidiary chapters have have changed, and so that's probably, I'm sure we won't at the end of that either. So, um, kind of connected to this and something that you brought up, I wanted to sort of circle back to, which is you mentioned some examples of um, the importance of including and honoring sort of indigenous peoples in terms of land management and so on. And so that's clearly, I mean, there's a whole spectrum, as you've mentioned, in terms of different types of people who maybe have been underrepresented or whatever. But thinking of indigenous peoples in particular for a moment, um, from your where you sit, like, is there like, what have we gotten right and what have we gotten wrong about our approach to that, or are we moving in the right direction? Is there any particular examples that come to mind of good or bad examples of how that's been done, or anything at all that comes to mind in that realm? And while
Yeah, I mean,
for just a sec, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to remind everybody that it's just the invitation that if you have comments or questions or your own perspective you'd like to share on some of these questions, please go ahead and at any time put them into the Q&A and we'll get to those down the line. Okay, sorry, back to you, Laura.
well, I mean, I obviously, there's a deeply tragic history of, in this country. And I think that, the environmental movement, even itself has a real history to reckon with of racism and kind of perpetuating violence, towards indigenous people. But I think in my experience and in my little window of time and space from the movement, I think there's a lot of things that are really going in a positive direction. I think we saw the big fight around Standing Rock was a real breakthrough moment and kind of a milestone, where I think the environmental movement began to take a lot of leadership from indigenous groups, and I think now, I think there's been a sea change in the time that I've been part of the movement, whatever the environmental movement, the climate movement, conservation movement, whatever kind of umbrella to put over it, where I think now, it's pretty overwhelmingly accepted and even kind of demanded, that there's an understanding of solidarity and support for Indigenous rights, and for, consultation and inclusion. And, one of the big American fights that I've been a part of in the last couple of years was the Line 3 pipeline, that was put through the headwaters of the Mississippi, northern Minnesota. And that was at the heart really an indigenous-led fight, and it was a time when I think a lot of the big organizations, including Rainforest Action Network that I work for, but the bigger national groups did participate and did support, but really did so, rather than sort of parachuting in and trying to lead the fight, really listened to some degree, and took that leadership from the folks who knew that landscape and whose heritage and way of life was being impacted. So I think there's a lot of positive movement there, and I've had the real just privilege and opportunity to get to know indigenous groups in, some in Indonesia, and to work with some indigenous groups in the Northern Amazon in Ecuador, and to really see some of those folks rise to real global prominence and be named, like Namonte Nankino to be named like one of Time's 100 most influential people in the past few years, and so I think there's a real openness and momentum there that I don't think was there before. One thing I do feel like there's obviously a lot further for this to go, and I think one thing is that right now there's sort of a solidarity on a human rights level with individual efforts and communities. But I think in bridging it into kind of the realm further into natural history, that we would really do well, as a movement and as organizations to go deeper into adopting an indigenous worldview and not just a solidarity. And I think universally an indigenous worldview is earth-centered, and it's much longer term, and broader thinking and much more grounded in place, and in the specific lessons and specific solutions that place demands and needs. And so I think endless lessons rather than kind of checking a box that we've done this consultation or that we've given, helped promote this voice. I think, a deeper integration of what does it mean to um, become more place-based and more earth-centered in our perspectives and our policies and our demands, is where I hope things continue to go in the in the movement and in the conversations that we're having.
Great. I'm just curious of what you've witnessed in because that's encouraging to hear of that sea change as you describe it. And is it in most of those cases, is it that the local indigenous groups reaching out to national environmental organizations and asking for the help, or how does that transaction go on? Or is it all over the map?
I think it's both, and it happens in different ways. I mean, I think uh, the indigenous leadership has always been there. So it's not like all of a sudden we have all of these amazing frontline fights and folks. I think it's more so that there's a reckoning and an understanding amongst the largely white-led organizations and that uh, you know the people who are most impacted by the issues that we're struggling with or the targets that we're issuing demands to need to be not just sort of consulted in sort of a performative way, but listened to and heeded. So I still think that's something that's um, unfortunately kind of in its infancy. And I think my optimism comes from how different things seem from my perspective now than they were a couple decades ago. Not from because, oh, we've arrived where we need to be, certainly. But I think there's more trust built too. I think that there's been a lot of, maybe some of those asks for support weren't happening before because there wasn't a foundation of trust to think that reaching out for support from these groups was, was worthwhile or was going to be something that would last or would be beneficial. And I think that some of those relationships have been forged and some of those yeah and so there's a bit more integration.
So it's become sort of a reinforcing or positive feedback loop that the more that they reach out and get um, good connection and support, then that makes them more likely to do it the next time, and so on and so forth. Yeah. Well, thank you. I find that quite encouraging as well. Because I wanted to shift gears here a minute. I mentioned when I was introducing you about your work in the Loser ecosystem in Sumatra, and you just a moment ago referred to Indonesia. I know I learned a lot about this place from you, and it kind of blew my mind a little bit, enough that at one point we were actually planning to lead a trip there for the institute, but then the pandemic hit, et cetera, et cetera. So, but can you just tell everyone a little bit about what the Loser ecosystem is and what's so special about it and what's taken you there?
Sure. Well, the Loser ecosystem is a region of northern Sumatra in Indonesia that's about roughly 6.5 million acres of intact primary rainforest. It's one of the largest intact areas of rainforest left in Southeast Asia. So it's just, of kind of global conservation importance. There's three major rainforest regions in the world. There's Southeast Asia, of course, the Amazon, and then the Congo region in Africa. And unfortunately, um, much of what used to be just a completely verdant, landscape in Sumatra in particular, but across Indonesia has already been largely destroyed and impacted by industrial plantation development, palm oil being the single biggest driver of destruction. And for a number of reasons, including the fact there was a autonomous movement and sort of a political fight that made it so that the corporations kind of couldn't come and wreak the destruction that they had elsewhere in North Sumatra. And because of that, this area was preserved. And so it's famous for being the last place in the world where you can find orangutans, rhinos, tigers, and elephants all in the same habitat. And in this case, that's Sumatran orangutan, Sumatran tiger, Sumatran and elephant, and they are, it's the last place that for each of those species that there's intact, viable breeding habitat. There's populations elsewhere, but if we're talking about, avoiding extinction in any kind of long term, the loser is completely crucial to their survival. It's just a magical place. It's one of the oldest forests in the world, which, and because it's on the equator, and it's so warm and wet, it's just had an uninterrupted kind of laboratory for evolution, and so it's up there with one of the most biologically diverse places in the world. And so we got brought in a little over a decade ago. There was a major crisis happening. What happens there? It's also of global significance because it's one of the highest concentrations of terrestrial peat domes in the world. And so peat domes are created through thousands and thousands of years of biological activity. It's a swamp basically, and when all the leaf litter and all the biological matter falls to the ground, instead of decomposing, it gets trapped in this anaerobic environment. And now you've got areas of deep peat that are 10, 20, some cases 30 or more feet deep over vast areas. And so it makes it one of the most effective areas for carbon sequestration in the world. But then the flip side of that is that in order to be developed for industrial plantations, the first thing they do is dig canals, lower the water table, dry out the landscape, and then set it on fire. And when it burns, it doesn't just burn on the surface, it burns deep down into that peat. And so you have these just catastrophic carbon bombs, released into the atmosphere. And, just to put it into perspective, when we were heading into the 2015, COP21 climate summit in Paris, the fires that were burning in Indonesia on the peat for this, purpose we're putting more carbon into the atmosphere than the entire US economy combined. So, so we're talking about, that's the scale, that's the global scale of kind of just, and that's just the carbon, and then of course there's the species. And then of course there's millions of people who depend on the clean water for their crops, who depend on, not having their villages crushed by the, flooding and landslides that are inevitable result of upstream logging. So it's sort of, wherever the palm oil has gone has become kind of a perfect storm of destruction. And so we've been fighting hard to put the Loser ecosystem on the map. It's someplace that very few people had ever even heard of. So we've been trying to really kind of tell the story of this important place and, have it be up there because, people know the Amazon, the Grand Canyon, the Great Barrier Reef, and have this kind of association that even if you may never go there in your own life, you know that it's important, and you're going to be against somebody trying to destroy it. And so we're trying to create that kind of cachet, so that corporations don't want to be associated with destroying it, and also so Indonesian people and Indonesian government to build that kind of identity and pride of that unique natural heritage that is worth so much more in the long term to preserve than to destroy. So. Yeah, so we've been doing a lot of sort of, in the short, trying to connect that destruction that we're able to identify in the Locer ecosystem, kind of follow all the way through the supply chain, and then connect it to the big household names, Nestle, PepsiCo, Unilever, on and on, that people, who we all have their products, in our shelves. And so, yeah, we do a lot of field investigations and then supply chain research to identify those connections, which companies are driving, purchasing from the producers that are, responsible for the destruction, and then run big public campaigns to try to expose them and get them to pass policies and implement those policies, to stop the destruction. And We've had a lot of success. It isn't certainly just because of us. There's a lot of factors, but in the last 5 years, unlike most of the rest of the world, the deforestation rates in Indonesia have actually gone down. Um, and uh, and so, there's a lot of hopeful factors to point to. There's going to be a whole movie coming out next year that we can point folks towards. But there's reasons for some cautious optimism, and there's a lot of things that are going at least in the right direction, even though there's a lot of work left to do.
Thank you for all your great work there and for enlightening me about it, because I was one of the many people who had never heard of it until you started telling me about it. And boy, for talk about charismatic megafauna, having all of those big, incredible mammals in particular is quite a cachet. I thought I would mention because I'm sure I'm not alone in the audience here tonight. If not, having been unfamiliar with it in the past, that Loser is spelled Leuser. If you want to look it up, and there's a lot of good information on the Rainforest Action Network website, among other places. So, well, that sort of taking that as an example. So you have done a lot of work in and for some of the wildest corners of the world, like the Loser ecosystem, like Tibet, etc. And you have also been involved, pretty deeply involved in a lot of urban activism on urban fronts, both in San Francisco and New York City, in particular. And so I'm just curious, do you see the needs, the work, the issue, approaches in those two, like really, more pristine wild places and very urbanized places? Are those similar? Are they different? Are they just points on a spectrum? Uh, I know you said something to me in a recent conversation that when because as you mentioned, you sort of alluded to recently that you're a relatively recent transplant to the East Coast, and that you were really struck by the fact that the buildings back there were older than the forests. That was a great insight. So, what any thoughts on the differences or similarities, or is it just an irrelevant distinction?
Well, I mean, obviously the experience of living in a wild rural place, is very different than living in Brooklyn. But also, I do think, you're no less, part of nature living in New York City than you are, living in Montana. And I think that's where the distinction does really just exist in our heads. I did live through the pandemic lockdown in New York City in a place, with no backyard, and really that helped really highlight, kind of background the people and forefront the nature. And for me, it was fascinating to see that, when you're in New York City, you are in the middle of the Eastern Flyway. And all of the neotropical migrants are passing through not even just Central Park, but our little backyard with its non-native trees, and that we could look out over through our window. There's whales returning to the harbor in New York. You could be on the subway, going from Brooklyn to Manhattan and not know that there's a humpback whale passing over your head. We found a seahorse on the beach the other day, in New York City. I mean, so, the oyster beds are coming back, right on the side of Manhattan, and after, the Hudson River, being just a chemical wasteland, just decades ago. So, I think that it's very important that we don't have any kind of concept of a sacrifice zone. We're already, heavily urbanized as a society and as a species, and it seems to be just going further that direction. And so I think it's really crucial that this illusion that we can just create an entirely human concocted landscape, and that it has got a boundary between that and nature, is false and dangerous ultimately. And so I think there's a lot of benefit both for just basic survival. We all are breathing the air, we're all eating, food that's coming from farms, but also just in, mental health and human delight. It is to to be able to have a set, New Yorkers are, and I know that I'm sure, Chicago and Dallas, and I'm sure other people like this too, but people are fiercely proud of where they are. You don't talk smack to a New Yorker about New York. If you're a New Yorker, you can really do it to another New Yorker. But I think having people have a sense of like a summer tanager, or a rose-breasted grosbeak as a New Yorker too. And they pass through by the thousands. And if we light up our buildings at night, they're going to die by the thousands. And so there's just, I think, integrating an identity and an intimacy of natural history. There's no reason inherently that can't be a very urban understanding. And so, in fact, I think it's crucial, that there is that affinity and feeling of relationship, and it's not, and also because where the political and economic power lies, we're not going to drive policy and make the system changes we need if it's just, you know, rural people and academics who are, and so I think that there's a lot of work to be done there. And we can see some interesting examples. I mean, right now there's only two cities, I think, in North America that have like biodiversity policies, San Francisco and Toronto. But I think we need to have biodiversity departments in all of our cities that are overseeing what trees are planted, so that we don't just have Australian street trees. We have urban forests, that are producing the food that the birds need, and that are and that the pollinators need. And that's just an example. It goes on and on and on. But I think it really just when it comes to social equity, when it comes to ecological health, when it comes to mental well-being, every single factor, and it's all borne out by science, is increased when we break down that boundary, bring nature into the cities, and bring urban people into the nature. And so I think there's a lot of important work to be done there, and a lot of people doing really cool work, to break down those sort of stereotypes of who goes hiking, and who loves birds, and who, that kind of a thing. And hope to see that happen on a much bigger scale, become a snowball effect.
And those are great examples. And it seems like there's lots of different hooks there, sort of political hooks. And when you mentioned Toronto, it reminded me that there was a pretty well regarded study came out just about 5 years ago, in that they did studies in urban Toronto and compared a whole series of parameters of human health, comparing different blocks of the city depending on the density of trees. And it became clear that people living in a higher density of trees in the city equated to being younger, stronger, healthier, etc. And so it was,
And
also
just the temperature differentials. I mean, neighborhoods that have tree cover will be, 10 to 20 to more degrees cooler on a hot summer day, than ones where it's just pavement reflecting the sun back, one neighborhood next to another. And then, of course, you trace it back, and that's usually due to, redlining decades ago, or, some underlying kind of, systemic racism. So, I think that's when you pull it, yeah, at the strings of one, you get right back to the other. And so I think, anywhere we can break down those kind of, yeah, false divisions, we're doing the best work.
great. Well, I was going to ask you something. We have time for just a couple more questions, and I want to turn to questions that are coming in, and again, invite you to type in a question and or comment in the Q&A via the Q&A tab at the bottom there. But it strikes me that most effective activism is really based on skilled storytelling. And so I was going to ask you, like, what are some of the key kinds of stories that you've used, and how often is natural history, which is, literally means the story of nature, the roots of the words, invoked? But it seems as though you've just been giving a lot of really nice examples of that, in the way that you tell stories, like thinking of summer tanagers as New Yorkers, et cetera, et cetera. But is there anything else you'd want to say about that?
I guess just that I think if the last decade or so of our, social political reality has shown anything conclusively, it's shown that, humans are not logical creatures. Like we do not make decisions collectively based on logic, on facts, and I think that as a movement, and as sometimes rational, nature-loving people, we can be stuck in this thing of, well, if people just knew, if they just had, and it's just it doesn't work. It's not, at least it's not, if you're not in an echo chamber, and so I think, but we are story-based creatures, and we form our identity of who we are and how we fit into our community and what our role is all, very much, we're still, we haven't changed fundamentally, just because our surroundings have, about who we are. And so I think, capturing people, and rather than, and I think, guilt and shame and evidence of destruction just shuts people off. And I know that I am guilty of that myself, because you just kind of feel like, oh my God, did you hear this? If, it's like, once we get to 2 degrees, we'll really change. Once we get to, it's like, global warming. So I think that we really have to take a deep breath sometimes and see, where are people coming from? What's their underlying rationale? And realize, people all have, there's certain, everyone loves their kids. Everyone wants their grandkids to be happy and healthy. Everyone wants, everyone wants to feel like they are, the good guy or doing good in the world. There's some very basic things that seem almost too simple to kind of say out loud. But if you put the filter of sort of the work that we're doing through some of these basic, human realities, it can really alter the approach that we're taking. And so, it just, and I admit myself, it's really easy to get caught up in the divisiveness and the just pure kind of worldviews colliding that seem like there's no reconciliation possible. But I think starting back at kind of an original, at a story that puts us together in the same story. And one of my sort of, hopes, I think, as we're, you know, things seem severe now, but we know that they're going to get more severe before they get better. And one of my hopes is, I think survival is a very powerful motivator. And I think when, more and more people, we had here on the East Coast, we had the fires from Canada this year, introduced tens of millions of people to ground level, debilitating wildfire smoke for the first time. Stuff people on the West Coast have unfortunately become used to. But this was tens of millions of people just got a dose of like, whoa, that's not okay. And so, I think being able to capture people's budding understanding of sort of the threat that this poses to their families, and how the role that they can play in making a change is something we've got to get a lot better at doing.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Well, I want to ask you, I said that there was 2 questions I've asked each of our special speakers, and so yeah, as I mentioned, that the series, the subtitle of the series is "Facing the Future in This Present Moment," and so I'm curious, what is um the kind of most hopeful, positive world that you can feasibly see in our collective future? Like, and what, in other words, what's as kind of visionary as you can be, but as being grounded at the same time, not just pie in the sky. And and then, and you can take, well, we'll start with that, and then I have a sort of follow up.
Yeah, that's hard because sometimes I feel like, it's like fake it till you make it. Like I don't want to make something up that I don't believe. But at the same time, I guess I would maybe start with saying that there's been a level of resilience that's just been demonstrated to me from the natural world that does give me a lot of hope. I remember as a kid when there was, I think, one pair of peregrine falcons left, west of the Mississippi. And I remember I grew up on the Central Coast, and in high school, I remember being told, oh, or when I was younger, being told, oh, by the time you graduate high school, Monterey pines will be extinct because there was a blight that was affecting them. There's been a lot of things like that. And here we are, and now the densest population of peregrine falcons in the world is in New York City. And they've really they're all over and so I think we've seen that, and living here on the Hudson River, and seeing just the rebound of biodiversity and of nature, what used to be just a toxic dumping ground. So I think that there's that inherent resiliency that when we make changes, the effects of the Clean Water Act, of the Clean Air Act, of some of these, things that we have done have demonstrated that we can do big things. We can change our behavior, and it can have profound, fairly quick responses from the natural world. Like that's actually just a fact. That's actually demonstrable at this point. So that gives me a lot of hope. And I also think, that what we can see in a generation, is um, you know, kids these days, are growing up in a world where the climate crisis is something that they've known since they knew anything. There's a world, and so I think that we can see, within a generation, I think it's totally plausible that we could see a collective global shift of priorities. I think I just said a minute ago that like survival is a strong motivator. And I've been surprised by other political things. I'm queer, and I, the legalization of gay marriage happened, in a political, snap of the fingers. Took me by surprise as somebody who's invested, and so I think sometimes we can be too pessimistic, and I think we have to have the imagination, that uh, major things can happen, and the technology is there, the potential is there, and I don't not to, I hate to use a war metaphor, but the all hands on deck kind of like galvanization that we've seen in past generations around like a war effort, everybody planting gardens, changing their behavior because they were part of a common cause, is something that humans can really do. And I've been, I traveled to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, and have been, in some communities after very devastating wildfires, and, a lot of instances of real trauma and destruction where you think people might be at their worst has been the times when I've been most inspired by seeing people really actually come together and be at their best, and be really selfless, and all of a sudden get to know their neighbors, and be very generous. And so that gives me, hope that as things continue to get worse and worse, it won't just be a free for all, everyone for themselves, but they could actually really ignite, kind of a collective transformation.
Hmm. Thank you. That's great. Is there any kind of last question, then we'll get to the Q&A. Um, is there any particular sort of approaches to living, actions, attitudes, whatever, that you would kind of encourage all of us who are listening and watching tonight to consider to get to that point, and obviously for all sorts of different reasons, health, age, etc., that many folks may not be um, inclined or able to get themselves to the front line, chaining the pipelines or whatever it might be. But what is, from your perspective, often on the front lines, what is really helpful?
Well, there's a thousand ways probably that to answer that question. I mean, I think everyone has a role to play. And and I think sometimes people can be discouraged by feeling like, oh, it's not my place to, be marching on the halls of Congress or locking to a tree or something like that. And it's like, yeah, okay, but whether it's donating resources to the people who are doing good work, whether it's volunteering in our communities. I mean, I think there's everyone has something that they can contribute. And, within the context of this conversation, as I kind of, we started to touch on earlier, I think it's, natural history comes in as a critical strand, because what we desperately need is people who understand their place. And I don't mean their, I mean understand their actual place, and what are the unique species where you live? What are the, ecological processes that are happening, in that bioregion? And unfortunately, those are becoming lost. That knowledge is actually, we can take it for granted, and I think sometimes people diminutize natural history and think of like, oh, Victorian naturalists categorizing, stuffed birds in a museum or something, when actually, there's a very fresh, urgent, modern role for natural history, which is, and I think it also goes back to that kind of concept of, indigenous perspective on the landscape. And the language there is sensitive because of the fraught history. So I don't know quite how to yet be most concise, but I think inspiring people to go outside and to look around and to gain that kind of intimacy um, with where they live, wherever it is, that will in turn, inspire them to defend it when it comes to it, is a role that, if just thinking of the audience, this might be, if natural history is your, I think there's a very relevant role for that kind of knowledge and that kind of passion, um, you know, in the movement at hand and in the movement that's coming.
Yeah, thank you. That's awesome. That's uh so in the context of this whole series, savoring and saving the world, what you're kind of saying there is that that too is a false dichotomy, that natural history sort of bridges that divide, that the very practice of savoring the world as we do natural history is in fact part of the work of saving the world, and the inspiration for it as well. Yeah,
You said it better. Yes, that's
that's
I agree that the distillation, yeah.
yeah. Well, thank you. Well, let's get to I'm trying to be attentive to the time, but we have at least a couple questions here, and feel free to add more if something comes to mind. Um, so Gary, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Gary. He says, in Australia, where Indigenous people are involved, often the environmental outcomes are much better, like what you've been saying. Certainly, areas which are culturally burned by those who know and love the country fared so much better in the wildfires of 2019. But these practices need a lot of effort and energy for which there are few people. How might it be scaled up when there are so few Indigenous people in many places?
Yeah, I think that uh, you know, it gets to sort of one of the topics we were talking about earlier, which is, for folks that are doing this work, um, not just to be in solidarity and support, the efforts of Indigenous people, which of course is extremely important, but to also adopt a more Indigenous worldview ourselves. And I think, we're seeing in the West, as folks in California and Arizona and the American West certainly know, we're paying the price in a bad way, for willfully, for losing that knowledge. The indigenous people all over the West used fire as a cultural tool, and they knew what time of year to do it, and what landscapes and when, and the sort of Western impulse to suppress and control is coming back to bite us in a way that we're going to be dealing with for generations. And so yeah, so I think it's not just about, and I also think a lot of times with the amount of oppression and challenge that indigenous groups have faced, asking them to be the ones to do the work is not fair. So it's not about putting it on them. It's about learning and doing the best we can to integrate it into science and policy and education, and have people really, I think, just to sort of restate again, I think there's been like a trivialization of that kind of knowledge, that it's like it's a nice hobby, to go out and learn the birds or something. And it's like, actually, no, there are, very real consequences, like life and death, ultimately consequences of being ignorant or informed about the landscapes that we live in. And so I think, I don't know if that answered the question by so much, but uh, um, yeah,
And
learning from the folks that are there and adopting what we can. I feel like a lot of natural history can feel like we're like the kids trying to play catch up with what used to be common sense. It's like when when your life depended on knowing what food was going to be where, when, and when the storms were going to come, then life just was natural history. And then the more divorced we've become from it, so much of that knowledge has been lost. And then, now we're kind of like, yeah, trying to play a lot of catch up for something that was purposefully destroyed.
yeah. So in terms of Gary's question, which was about how to scale up, it's just like taking that kind of insight and honoring it and trying to spread it as widely as possible, including in areas where there is not currently robust indigenous populations, and that natural history is perhaps one of the practices that helps us do that.
And then of course, honoring, funding, supporting the kind of education that gets us to that knowledge is, I mean, I ended up at Prescott College because it was like one of one handful, I think, of places in the country where you could study natural history. There's a lot of ecology, and that's very important, and a lot of hard sciences in universities. But as a discipline, it's been just kind of marginalized and undervalued. And so I thought I'm probably preaching to the choir to say but it just seems you know, really important to support any kind of programs like that we possibly can.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Okay, looks like we have one more question, unless anything pops in right in the last moment or two here. Edie asks, she says, "What a great conversation. I love Laurel's fully integrated view and amazing way of articulating this view." And then she says, "Please tell the story of adventures on the Tibetan border."
Oh gosh.
Maybe
Um,
an hour.
yeah, thanks, Edie. That's really sweet. And we're also working on a movie about that. It's a very big story. The shortest version I think I can say is, and I was not at all a strategic mastermind behind this. I was, drafted as a supporter, but the short of the long is that, in 2000, well, the Chinese government got the Olympics in 2008, and one of the ways they got it, besides a lot of corruption and bribery, was to promise the longest, most spectacular torch run the world had ever seen, and that included up and over Mount Everest and down through, military occupied Tibet. And so Tibetans around the world saw this as a once in a generation opportunity to bring this to the world because, the Olympic, the torch is meant to be this symbol of international unity. And the idea that the world was supposed to stand around and clap while it was paraded through Tibet, that's under this brutal occupation, was just too much to bear. And so there was Tibetan activists in exile had gotten the refrain, the slogan that the Olympics was going to use, which was "One World, One Dream." But nobody had heard it yet. And so we decided we wanted to do the most high profile thing we could think to add a stanza. And so that the first time millions of people would see that term, it would say "One World, One Dream, Free Tibet." And so the idea was to get into China, then get into Tibet, and then get to the side of Mount Everest, and then infiltrate the Chinese climbers' camp, and then unfurl a banner that said that. But it all had to be broadcast live because We knew we would be arrested by the Chinese military, and we were afraid we could disappear to the world without but that had never been done before. Something like broadcasting live. This was 2007, so this was like Twitter had just been invented, and so long story short, through an incredible series of cloak and dagger, you know, uh, tactics, we were able to pull that off. And so we were arrested by the Chinese military. They held us in interrogation for days. It became a big international incident. My mom I see is on here, and she was. The media was at our parents' senators. Our parents were in senator's office. It became went up to the level of the White House, and eventually they released us. Um, but we were trying to kind of capture their global moment where they were trying to seek, legitimacy as a world power and expose sort of the horrific um, human rights abuses that are happening there. But the environmental exploitation and destruction there is equally as just egregious and mind-boggling. So a lot more there. There was years of related activism, and there still is, of course, including in San Francisco just a couple weeks ago when Xi Jinping visited. So, yeah, there's a lot of solidarity with the environmental movement and with the Tibetan movement.
So we should watch for the movie.
Yeah, it fingers crossed.
Yep.
We'll get it out to the world.
Great. And I see one more question came in, and so we'll squeeze this in, and then we'll have to wrap it up after that, I think, since it's getting late. So Hazel asks, she says, how does an urban type activist deal with fatigue and frustration, fighting the same battles with urban planners and bureaucrats again and again?
Oh, I wish, yeah, I
Wish you had a
felt
good.
like I could answer that question. Um, I'll say for me, and that's not my plate exactly. But my partner actually is an urban planner. That's why we moved to Brooklyn, and he is doing work at the intersection of urban planning and conservation, and natural history, actually, environmental education, all that. Uh, but I think for me, for the like immersion in the natural world as much as I can get is my biggest source of mental health. Even just a 20-minute walk. Like when I just, the amount of hours I spend on Zoom and then just inundated with uh, you know, apocalyptic information, you just have to sometimes close the laptop and go outside. And that's probably I don't know, the most consistent thing that I have found is that reconnection to kind of getting out of my own way and my own human chatter of everything and taking a deep breath and taking in as much, even in an urban environment, there's always nature. Um, and then I guess also connecting, with folks who are doing the good work who can commiserate goes a long way. And I don't know exactly what kind of work you do, but maybe it'd be interesting. I'm happy if Tom, if you share my information. My partner works in a small kind of world of folks who are having a lot of conversations about how to influence, urban planning policy, for environmental and biodiversity causes. And I know it's unfortunately not thousands and thousands of people. It's an emerging field. And so it seems a good thing for folks to know each other. And I know he's come back from some various conferences and small gatherings, really inspired and kind of renewed by being able to connect with folks who speak his language and understand, um, affirm and validate the work and um, yeah, I don't know if that's that helpful, but
Yeah, Hazel just said thank you. And I'll say that if anybody has follow-up things, I think we're gonna have to wrap it up here. I apologize to those questions we didn't get to, but if there's anything you need to follow up on, you could uh, contact me, care of the Natural History Institute, and I can try to connect people as best possible. So I do think in the interest of time, we need to wrap it up here tonight. And I just want to thank you, Laurel, for your time, not just tonight, but all of your wonderful work in the world for so many years. It's been very inspiring to me to witness as well. And so thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Tom. Well, you were a big player in a very formative time, so I appreciate it back at you, and really happy to be a part of this series and conversation.
Yeah, thank you. And thank all of you for making time for this program and this series and the Institute, especially at this very, very busy time of the year. And again, to remind you that tonight's program, as well as the 3 previous programs, are available actually right away on the Natural History Institute YouTube channel, which you can subscribe to. And so if there's somebody that you know was hoping to make it and couldn't make it or whatever, you can just give them the link to that. And that would be great. Also, I would encourage you to consider supporting the Natural History Institute in your year-end giving, if that's appropriate, since the Institute is one of the organizations trying to fight the good fight to get this way of looking at the world more broadly encompassed. So again, thank you, Laurel. Thank you, everybody. And for now, we'll say good night and have great holidays, everyone.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, everyone.